Welcome back to the Power of Our Story. My name is Gregorio. I'm a law enforcement professional in Pacific Northwest for about 19 years and counting. I'm also a Army Reserve soldier. I'm about to retire in my 24th year this year in October. Um, we're going to continue the talk that we had last week, focusing on betrayal and shame. It was such an in-depth conversation last week on betrayal that we didn't even finish wrapping that up and definitely didn't hit shame, but I hope to accomplish that today. Kind of where I'd like to leave off with that. Well, as we go, just kind of lay the ground rules here. Um, People are very vulnerable, and sometimes things pop up in these conversations that start to get deep, or maybe you're still dealing with some things, and maybe you're still a current service member in some sort, or you don't feel like you want something recorded. Please just let me know, and we can pause it and have whatever conversation, and then we'll start re-engaging in the conversation recorded once we get through the delicate things. So kind of to start where we left off, I remember saying the last time that betrayal requires an implied trust between two people, two entities. And I think that oftentimes for me, the way I look at these things is we kind of conflate organizations, businesses, as something that we can trust. I think that it's a bunch of individuals that we put our trust in, that we say as an organization, and we may be betrayed by one or two of those people, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a whole organization. Now, remember the last questions that I asked is how many of you truly believed that you had this unbreakable type trust or relationship with your organization? To my surprise and shock, most of you rose your hands. When I asked that question around the organizations that I deal with, most people raise their hands too, until I start asking a few more questions. And some of those questions are, okay, for an organization, how many do you trust your internal investigations? How many do you trust your auditors? And most people will be like, nope. If I asked you, would your CEO or HR manager put you in front of the front line or whatever is best for their business? Most people would say no. Okay. So maybe there's actually barriers and layers to the amount of trust that we have with our organizations. And where I go with that is if we've been done wrong. Um, I think we've all probably been done wrong in some sort of way by our organizations or the people within the organization. But for me, I don't feel that I've been betrayed. Because frankly, there's only a certain level of trust that I'm willing to give an organization. There's a lot of people within the organization that I give full trust to. And those people in decision-making processes, from my experience, haven't necessarily done me wrong. Some people try to stand up for you. Um, but if I'm not giving my full trust, have I then betrayed that organization, at least in the way that I'm putting that? And that's, again, not to say that you haven't been done wrong. There hasn't been some misdeed that has been done to you. But I try to break that down because betrayal is one of those words that is so deeply rooted with emotion, and usually it's a very impactful emotion. And when I'm talking to first responders or military folks that are on the brink of suicide, having suicidal ideations, or have attempts, or in the process of attempting, betrayal and shame are two of the most common words that come up. So if there's any way that the reason for this conversation to break some of that down and to have a little bit less an impact of the wrongdoing that was done to you, maybe that helps you make it through um, that moment, that process, that wrong that was done to you, because maybe it wasn't quite being betrayed. If you can single it out to a person who made a decision, I would then ask, well, how much trust did you have in that individual? Well, F that guy or F that gal, I didn't trust them at all. Okay, so you could probably predict that that would be an outcome maybe that would come from this individual who might be representative of an organization. Um, what do you guys think about that? Let's open that part up for discussion. What do you think about trying to layer that out uh, in your own experiences? Do you think that that would lessen the impact of what we've called betrayal before, if you can kind of level that out in some sort of way?
Well, my organization is very small. Most of you have met the other half of my organization. And we are blessed not to even be concerned about that. We just would not cross our minds to do that. However, there were times, especially in the federal component of law enforcement, where the degree of integrity was not present, even though they wanted to imply that it was. And that is a setup for betrayal. And so, Chris, to your point about trusting individuals within the organization versus the leadership, the management, the organization itself, that is a very important distinction. And I thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Paul. Anybody else have any insight on that? Sarah?
Michelle, were you going to say something?
Oh, you can go ahead.
Okay. I am thinking about one situation. I think of it as a huge learning lesson for me. And because I had an expectation that people in this arena, I just had an expectation that they would behave in a certain way, and that there would be good conversations to get to clarity, and that we would want to get to a solution. It turned out going in such a sideways direction, but I just kept having this expectation that of course we're going to resolve this. And I learned that not everybody cares to resolve and to try to get to the best solution. And I'll tell you something, I was heartbroken. I was really heartbroken because it actually changed my trajectory going through that. But I learned this beautiful lesson that has freed me so much. And that is to trust what you're seeing, to not doubt yourself, to not have an expectation that everybody cares, because it's just not true. So when they show you, or when people around you show you that they're not interested in a conversation or getting to clarity or finding the truth, just believe it and just move on quickly and find the people who do, so that you can be stronger together. That was a huge takeaway. That was a huge boundary building that I couple with my empathy side. That used to get me in trouble at times, because you have to have solid boundaries if you're high in empathy. So it was a beautiful lesson for me. It was tough, but I am so grateful. It was a gift.
I like it. Thank you, Sarah. Michelle?
I was just thinking about, like, when I first came into dispatching, I was 19, still a baby in the eyes of law enforcement. And so I actually came in with 100% full blind trust in every single person in my department. And for me, it was like, well, I grew up knowing you're supposed to call the police if you need help. And so for me, it was very maybe naive, but a blind trust. And within my first 2 years, it was solidified that you can't have that. And from that point on, I started taking my trust. And unfortunately, I say unfortunately, but it's worked in the negative in my personal life too at some points. But I started treating my trust as an onion. The full 100% blind trust that I have for very few select people is at the core of it. And every time I went and worked with two different agencies, and I always went with guards up or with my layers up. And for some people, maybe I had a mentor or two in the department, they would get a couple more layers in than maybe other people. But I really started, I think that's what made me guarded, because I'm a huge empath and my boundaries were not healthy or solidified when I first came into the field. So I kind of had to, toughen up that aspect of myself real quick.
Okay, and do you think that worked out for you, having those different layers?
I think if I would have done it more productively, while also making sure that I had a better understanding of my why and why, why I was in this field, why I was doing this, and why I wanted to help people. And I think if I had a more solid understanding, I think that onion layered concept would have done a lot better for me.
So if I'm hearing you right, would you, if I was to put a new word on that or definition, uh, would you say that having a realistic level of trust with certain individuals, does that kind of encompass that rather than
Yeah.
being kind of like all in or Leroy Jenkins all in, as we might say? You're leveling up through people are earning deeper levels of trust.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's important to accept the fact that not everybody is going to earn more than that first layer of trust. And that's okay.
And in this realm of being first responders and military, how easy do you think that it is to get wrapped up in that? Probably because of the way we were brought up, our ideal of what these professions or organizations are that we want to work with. That automatically you go in there with that, not eyes wide open, but eyes wide shut, maybe blind trust.
Yeah. I think that's a very common thing, more than people tend to admit.
And what do you guys think about as far as that trust stuff and being in that echo chamber? What kind of effect that has with that, both on the positive side of the trust, in which now I could almost argue that specifically within law enforcement, is that echo chamber is don't trust anybody, and that's even probably more dangerous and negatively impactful than the blind trust going forward. Janet, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to that first question.
Please.
I went in very proud into the organization I went into, and for a long time. But I learned that I think that a lot what Sarah was saying is that the lessons that I learned throughout it has made me who I am now. But I learned that it's the people and some of the management and some of the people you worked with that you loved and you stuff. And when they got into management, they changed. They changed radically to the position of which they had complained about as much as the rest of us had. So I learned to separate those who had been my friends at work to be friends outside of work and leave work and my judgment of what they did there. We didn't take it out of the office to do. In fact, I spent limited time with them outside of work until they had left. And then we could build that relationship of friendship again. But it goes up. Even when there was a time when it looked like upper echelon was taking control and walked our manager out, who had been very verbally abusive and passive aggressive. She got a cushy job. She got a real cushy job out of that. And then her counterpart, who had been like her second and acted the same way, they put that person in charge. So it got to the point where I left and came back as a contractor, where I had control of how I handled things and the people I worked with in that. So it's the growing up and the taking care of you, as opposed to this is the way it is and this is so. I had to learn to live my values and what I believed in. Didn't diminish my pride of being part of that organization. It diminished my respect for some of the people in it.
I appreciate that perspective. Do you think that it sounds like that you had a pretty good barrier with those guys? Do you think that, and I believe that we're all leaders here, despite any ranks on your shoulders or your collars, I believe that we're all leaders in some sort of way. You don't need a title to be a leader. Do you think that in that, as we've spoken about before, about leading by example or living by example, living authentically, should we negate some of that? Do you think? And this is kind of uh, just to put out there's a couple hands up, that if we get to know each other better, we can see how authentic people are. Because I think that people are really good at putting on a face. I mean, I think that if in our personal lives and dating somebody, you know, very oftentimes people put on something that they're not, and you could probably get away with that a year, maybe 2 years if you're really good. But at some point, the real you comes out, which means that you can practice being that person that put on that face for a while in a professional zone without knowing. So if we, as leaders, again, non-official leaders, try to get to know each other a little bit more to see how much you can trust those people rather than just that super layered thing. Just throw that out there. Paul, your hands up.
Yeah, and it's up for a particular reason. Michelle mentioned something a moment ago that hadn't crossed my mind in years. At age 19, she understands what her why is. And I was 19, but it was in a different century. If somebody had said why, I would have said because, and that would have ended it at that age. And so that's a level of maturity that allows people to do things that they otherwise would do or would not do based on their perceptions. And I think that's incredibly important, to have somebody as young as she was understand the business about the why and how important it is in determining what we do and how we behave.
And I'll throw this out there in the realm as well. What are ways that you think that you can test that? You know, those different layers. Jim, you got your hand up, sir.
I was just going to touch on a few things. I thought I had it all figured out when I started as well. And
don't we all?
And as Sarah heard yesterday, Michelle, I'm not going to try to one up you, but I actually started in the paid profession as a dispatcher at age 16 as a junior in high school. And you know, and I got there because I had started at age 14 in an Explorer Scout program where people took me under their wing and told me, you know, taught me what was important. And I embarked on that profession because my why was to serve other people and to be there to, you know, support people and that type of thing. And that's where I, you know, kind of took my whole career. On the trust side of things, I think the trust for me was very easy to achieve in the small unit type of thing. You know, the team that, you know, I was putting myself in jeopardy with and that type of thing, that we were working collectively together to do the why, you know, to be there to serve people and take care of things. I think that trust was very easy. But really early on in my career, because of experiences, I learned to be fairly non-trusting of senior leadership, public officials, you know, that just didn't seem to be having my best interest or the best interest of my peers from our perspective in their mind, right? It was always, how can we get more out of you for nothing? You know, or, you know, that type of thing. And so there just wasn't a lot of trust, you know, with respect to the way they dealt with doing their jobs, right? And I eventually got to those positions myself. You know, I served as the assistant city manager and city manager in a city for a while. And so I went to all those levels. I think the unique difference, at least in my mind and stuff, is about role models and going back to Janet's comment about you know, people that were, you know, that complained bitterly about the people above them, and those people left, and then they promoted into that position, and they acted just like them, if not worse. And I saw that a lot too, and I think that was a role modeling thing, and that was you know, in the one organization I talked a lot about it is we were raised in that organization by a senior leader that was in that position for many years, right? And it's just like raising your children, right? We all know how that goes. And so I think a lot of us who didn't seek out other alternatives or see other patterns of good behavior, good leadership, that type of thing, we just did what we knew, right? We evolved following in the footsteps of our father, you know, type of thing or whatever, and that's the patterns of behavior we learned, and we acted. A lot of people just sort of followed that path and acted that way, and I do believe a lot of it has to do because they either never had a good role model, or they didn't go seek, you know, they didn't identify that like that is not like what I want to be. I'm going to go try to do something different. So that was kind of my perspective.
And isn't this a crazy thing? I mean, I think that at the beginning of our careers, they said you get bitter. At some point, everything becomes bullshit and everybody becomes an asshole, right? But for as long as I can remember, we've been talking about that. We've been training about it. Why is it that it's so hard to skip that cycle and to change? What is that common link that we just is it Stockholm syndrome where we just keep repeating the same things because we don't see that much out of it? To me, it kind of comes back to what we'd spoken about a couple weeks ago. I think it was with I don't know, maybe it was this call talking about debriefs, and I think that as I think it was Janet talking about the boundaries, or maybe it was Michelle. I think that those, if you're early on in your career, if we go back to these debriefs, you can kind of test those boundaries with people into how deep you're willing to go in those debriefs, because you can push back a little bit, and then it'll kind of gauge for you where you're at. If I give a little bit of pushback and you know they crush you down, then obviously they want an echo chamber. They don't want real debriefs, and that'll kind of help you temper your expectations of the trust within your organization, or at least your small bubble. Let's see, Paul, you had your hand up, sir.
Oh, I think Janet was there first. Go ahead, Janet.
Oh, go ahead, Janet.
Yeah, I wanted to expand on what Jim said about, you know, the people that we worked with and the negativity in that. But I want to say that there are nuggets. There was an officer I worked with in the early 80s. He was a corporal in a special section and was on call quite often. He kept the dispatch known every time. I'm leaving the house now, taking the dog for a walk. I'll be back in this. I'll check in. And I worked under him again later on when he was in charge of a watch as a sergeant. And he never changed. His demeanor never changed. He just treated everybody very well. And many years later, we had changed provinces, came back to the province, and he was now like a superintendent, and he never changed on how he thought. He came into the dispatch center and he remembered me, and like this is almost 20 years later, and he still treated that same. I worked with him in G8, and he always treated us with so much respect. And so as far as the negativity, those shining diamonds that show up, that I think is what keeps some of us to keep going. And unfortunately, he lost his life in an accident far too young for all of us, and mourned greatly by the whole force. But that person and how he showed up from being the corporal when I first met him to being the superintendent in charge of a whole huge area and international, he was amazing, and I'll always remember that. And that's where I think that's the role model that I would like to remember and emanate.
Thank you for sharing that personal story. That's awesome. And I think that that's a huge nugget here, is that to grab on to those impactful people, because I think that we all take the job saying, hey, I don't want to become X. I don't want to be that old crotchety individual. So don't grab onto that. I just wrote down a note here. Deliberately decide. don't react. We talk about because practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. If we practice doing the same old nonsense, you're going to become that nonsense. So make that deliberate decision to grab onto that happiness and that beacon, that consummate professional that you know of, so that you don't repeat that. And it's going to be one person at a time. We talk about in our combat casualty care classes here, it's more of a mindset training, and any of it's more of a mindset training. I'm recently got asked to be a fire instructor at this Marine instruction outfit, and I say that we can teach you all the fire stuff, and you can have all that knowledge, but if you not have the right mindset when any of these things happen, whether it's fighting fires, whether it's law enforcement, you're going to go what we call code black, and it's all going to go down the tube anyway, because you've reacted for so long and not making deliberate decisions to react, if that makes any sense. Paul, you got your hand up, sir.
I think that kind of where we're going with this, and at least in my mind, if you can gain a sense of another person's appreciation for your contribution, that's the beginning of building a bond of trust. And there are some people who clearly appreciate themselves more than anybody else, and that is another sign. It's a sign to put distance between us and them, and just not get involved in the drama and all of the other junk that goes with it. But I think the notion every human being has a need, and Maslow confirmed this years ago, has a need to be appreciated. And the leader that Janet was talking about clearly appreciated the people that worked for him, no matter where they were. And the fact that he could walk in 20 years later and say, "Hi, Janet," and mean it, speaks volumes about the quality of his character. My wife worked at Hoag Hospital in Newport Beach, and there was a guy by the name of Michael Stevens who was the CEO there for 25 years. And he would walk through the hallway and he would see housekeeping people and other folks that were literally at the end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum from him. And he'd walk up to him and he'd stop him and he'd say, "How's your son John doing? I heard he was hurt last week." And people would just get blown away by that. But he wanted to have this personal connection, and he wanted people to understand they were appreciated no matter what their role was. And as to the situation we call leadership, it is not about a role, it's not about a title, it's not about a pay raise. You either have the desire to be a leader and are willing to dedicate the time and the effort to become a leader and understand what the value of doing that is, or you don't. And I think perhaps to Jim's comment earlier, when people get promoted, particularly in law enforcement, and I suppose in firefighting the same way, but when they get promoted to what we can accurately characterize as a political level, and by that I mean they are more concerned about what the politicians think about them than they are about taking care of their people. And when that happens, things turn upside down fast. And I had a guy who was a patrolman in my squad years ago, wound up being the chief of police, and got fired. And it's because of that one defect. He was more concerned about the politicians who were coming down and asking him the hard questions than he was about the people that he needed to preserve and protect, as we say. So
Sadly, that seems to be a common thread. And as we kind of maybe wrap up the betrayal part of this, it seems to me that it's kind of coming back to, we were talking about a bunch of individuals, I think is what ended up happening, not an organization, not an inanimate object. So my point to that being, and that just kind of naturally and organically evolved that way, is that we paint our organizations a lot of times in these ways, but it's a bunch of different individuals along the way. And it also comes back to that word culture. We're betrayed because we have shitty culture. We're talking today, and the other things we talk about, the PTSD and all these other things, because of culture. We have a shitty culture, which comes back to another word that we often talk about, leadership. All these things are very entwined. And leadership doesn't create culture, in my opinion, as we talk about organizational leadership and pinstripes and bars. Leadership and culture changes at the lowest levels. It starts with an individual, a pair, which will affect a squad, which will affect a watch or a platoon, that will affect an entire precinct or whatever, and then it expands from there. Now, that being said, culture can be fast-tracked and have greater impact with good leadership. But if you have a shitty culture and the leadership may not be the greatest, it's going to start off at the bottom. But as you create that culture and spread it, those people are going to promote, and hopefully those people have been true to themselves, they've been authentic, they've been, following that formula that I have, being vulnerable, authentic, credible. Then that builds your trust, and then those people are promoted into those positions. That culture is going to stick. And again, it'll all dissolve if you don't maintain that at the bottom and keep that going. But again, it can be fast tracked by the leadership aspect of it. And so I hope that this part of this discussion has helped somebody at least unplug the um, the impact of betrayal from an organization, whatever that is. It could be whatever business out there. It could be a government organization for first responders or the military or whatever. Because then that says that, hey, everybody under there is kind of poison. And I think that has more pain and hurt and impact on you if you look at it that way. When we just had a discussion about a bunch of different organizations, nameless, obviously, but we were talking about the individuals and the great individuals that were there that positively impacted us. We somehow got sidetracked and sidebarred to the negative things and allowed those negative people to impact us. They're always going to exist. There's always going to be the bottom feeders that want to make their way to the top in any expedient way that they can. But we can choose to not let them get, to Michelle's point, too deep in our onion. We can keep some layers between us. We can still trust them because maybe they're good professionals in a way, but they're not good leaders. Maybe they're great at running organizations. I think we know a lot of people like that, but they might not be genuine people, but they do a phenomenal thing in the professional side. So I hope this, and we can continue to have this conversation as we keep going on, but I hope that gives some insight from half a dozen people as to how you can lessen the impact of the betrayal. Anything else on betrayal? Janet, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's interesting, like you said, about how our conversation evolved. And thanks to Jim for bringing up, because that reminded me about this officer that I was so grateful to know. But it's when we talk about this, and this is where conversation comes into it, as you leading us through it, yeah, we started with that betrayal, but look at how we evolved to those other things, those people that made a difference in our life. And I think that's where some of the conversations have to go, in that negativity, to just change that and to maybe bring us back to who are you? Who are you really? And who do you want to be? And who do you want to recognize as a leader, whether it be positive or negative? Like you always have that choice, but it's how you live life. Then are you going to live in that negative and complain about that leadership, or are you going to live in the positive and say, okay, I may not be able to change that leadership, but I don't have to become like that person or like how they're treating other people. I love the story about the janitor and stuff, because really, where would we be without these people that support us, right?
Absolutely.
Well,
And
that was a hospital in which there were 4,500 employees and 1,100 doctors. And it didn't matter who you were. If he walked up and saw somebody who was an employee that he'd never met before, he'd stop and introduce himself and ask them how they're doing. And ask them about their family and tell them a little bit about themselves, because he really wanted to know. And those people walked away floating on air, because this guy was the CEO, and he took the time and the trouble to do that, even though some of their superiors wouldn't do that. So that makes a huge difference to an organization. It really does.
oh, absolutely. And to your point there, and I don't remember if it was a book or just a story that I heard. The owner of Costco does that. That man takes a very nominal fee for what he could pay himself. He travels to all of the stores across the country. When somebody gets sick or whatever, he goes there and personally sees them. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? That's why Costco's been such a fruitful organization, because people are cared for. They feel valued, as you say.
Yeah.
And to read a little bit more on what Janet was saying, I know it's kind of comical or cliche, but the power of positivity is something really strong. There's a book called The Secret. Have you guys heard of it? It's called The Secret. For me, it's a little over the top and kind of corny in some ways, but it really, really does ring true. We tend to, because we're surrounded by all the negativity, we end up cycling ourselves with that rather than focusing on that the positive stuff. I mean, we've talked about it in all of our different instances we've been through as individuals and collectively here on this group. There's always something spectacular that comes out of the traumas. And the tragedies, but we sometimes have to look for those things. I don't know if any of you can tell me anything in your lives that you value, that you hold, that has ever been easy. I think it's all been a struggle. So for me, although not perfect, I find it very easy to find the positive things, for the happy things. Um, but it's years and years of making those deliberate decisions to find that in my most suck times, when I'm struggling the most, finding, okay, why am I feeling like this? All right, dummy, get out of this. What's the positive? What can be the positive? And it might not be a positive in the moment. What can I work towards, with a capital W, work towards, to find that positive thing? And it's very rare, if ever I can think of in my life, where I'm like, hey, I'm glad this is happening right now. This is awesome. It's always looking back. I'm glad this happened. I'm glad I walked through that fire, because something, wow, look at where I'm at because of whatever it was that we went through. Janet.
Yeah, I wanted to just mention about The Secret. I've been very blessed to meet some of those people that were in The Secret, and I trained with Jack Canfield, who was, and the story behind how The Secret came to be is quite interesting. But and he is, like, if anybody's read Chicken Soup for the Soul or his book The Success Principles, in which I'm certified in teaching, is that he is 100% who he is showing up, live or not. Like, he's been my teacher and mentor since 2010, and he came up to Edmonton to do a class, and I walked in the room, and he put his arms out and was happy to see me. And that is another role model. And I think one of the things we should do is make a list of our role models. Like, just this conversation has brought this up again for me to remember that. And that there is a book, and both of you, between The Secret and what Paul was saying about this doctor or this CEO, that there's a book called The Dream Manager. It's written by Matthew Kelly. And if we could all become that within our organizations, and some have nonprofits and that now, is that they finally hired a dream manager because their staff turnover was so high. So they brought this person in and they interviewed every single person in that business. And they said, what is something you've always wanted to do or what? And this one woman said, no one in my family has ever owned a house. So they brought in a financial planner to work with her. They had immigrants. We'd like to learn English. So then half a day a week, maybe they'd bring in a tutor to teach them English. And it just goes on. And it is a parable in that, but as it turns out, if we can be our leaders like that, what happens is your bleeding of your staff turns out to you're growing your staff. And as they grow, they bring other people like-minded into the business. And so, I don't know, I love that book, but, and many others, of course, but that is, you know, it's a mindset. You mentioned mindset. Really, if we can shift that mindset and stay away from that negativity, and if we have to be, you know, there's no way we can be away from it, we can make the decision not to participate in it.
That's beautiful.
There is a notion that about an affinity, and that is that one of the ways to grow your business, to grow your department, to grow whatever, is to get people that are internal to the organization to refer their friends in, because those friends tend to have the same values and the same beliefs that you do, which is why you're friends to start with. And if that's what's working in that organization, then obviously when it's time to hire, you need more of that. And so that notion of affinity is very important, and they did it at Hope, and they still do it.
Beautiful. I want to thank all of you for being so vulnerable, and for those who are going to watch this, if any of this stuff resonated with you and you have more questions on how any of us have kind of dealt with these things, please reach out. We're on LinkedIn, we're on YouTube. You can reach out to Sarah directly on LinkedIn, or anyone here on the screen. Any other bits of information on Betrayal? With your permission, I'd like to forego the shame game for now. I think it would be a huge disservice to even bring it up with just a few minutes left. If you're good with that. Oh, Michelle?
So I really enjoy the talk on betrayal, and I like the concept of breaking it down to associate it with people, not the organization itself. And another perspective of betrayal that I had to work through specifically for my incident was a betrayal of not like, it was a betrayal of human race, of humankind, because the main suspect and mine did such a horrific event that my brain could not process that a human could do what he did. And it was through a lot of therapy that I had to work out. At first, my anger was at a disbelief that anyone of human nature could even just commit this. And I had to break that betrayal down and say, this is not all of the human race. This is this one guy who there's a lot of circumstances that played into it. And I'm still, that does not help the sense of betrayal from him, but it helps me not have that negative lens on to look out to the world and say, who else is like him? Is everybody like him?
Yeah, and thank God that everybody's not. And he absolutely violated his social contract, right? Here's the ugly truth to that. There are those people out there. But whether it's for 2 weeks or 50 years, 40 years, that's why people like you exist. That's why people that are in the service-minded professions, first responders, military, that's why we exist. I had those feelings for a long time excavating mass graves in Kosovo. I didn't understand how that kind of evil could exist. But, you know, those things do have impacts, but that evil does exist. But that's why we exist, to combat that evil, to deal with that evil, to shoulder those burdens, so that others don't have to. And not always do we survive those things for a career. But we all make our career to say that. Our careers aren't defined by amount of time. Michelle, Jim, Janet, Paul, Sarah, we can only give what we have. When our gas tanks are full, we can't give any longer. And sometimes we have to then pass that torch to somebody else who has the reserve tanks or a fresh tank, a brand new car, if you will, a brand new fire engine to put out those fires. But I think that that's a huge thing that we've talked about here for a long time is it's okay to say no, and you have to give yourself grace to deal with these things that you've dealt with. And that's, again, why we exist here. Because no matter how hard we combat it and how hard we fight it, as long as there's good, there will always be evil. And, it's good folks that are willing to stand up on the line to defend over those who can't, unwilling, or won't. So thank you for shouldering that. We've all been through our things. I don't know how I would handle that. Those are the most vulnerable of people that we're sworn to protect. And understand this. Even as we're sworn to protect, we can't protect everybody. God has still given us free will. And that goes all the way around. So thank you for being those warriors. Thank you for standing on that line. Has that's somehow become a bad word anymore, I guess. But whatever that line is for you between good and evil. And thank you for the sacrifice that you and, for me, more your families have put up with to do those things. But always give yourself grace. Keep talking those things out. Latch on to those positive people. Make that deliberate decision to do it. Don't take the easy way and kind of go with the negativity, because it's going to take your strong leadership, your strong moral character to guide forward. And as we've talked about all those people that we've got kind of grabbed onto that were those positive beacons, be that positive beacon. Don't be the negative one. And don't make it so hard for those young ones to grab onto you. And maybe you even put your hand back and grab onto them and bring them with you. So with that, thank you for being so vulnerable and open. If we have nothing else, I think we can conclude there. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, please reach out.